This lesson, we're going to be working on putting in the features. So what I'll be doing in this is going through the eye, some of the surrounding fat, how the eye is held in place. From there, we'll work into the nose and cheek, and then from there into mouth and kind of lower jaw area. So we'll start out with the eye in this one. So first thing would be, and now that we're dealing with the eye, what are some simple ways that you could think about the placement of the large form? So in this portrait here, again, we're going back to those big ideals. Again, my intention in this is not to try to replicate the model's likeness that we have here. It's to use it as an example or a departure point so I could give you the rough construction of those features and how I would start to create that generalized look. So here, wing of the nose, when I bring that up, that's going to give me the corner of the eye. So that's just kind of a relational measurement that I like to use pretty often. And then the other one that I'll use, even though it's a little early, is if you can give a rough approximation of where the corner of the mouth is. It's common that we could see this as leading us near the center of the eye. So you can see his is a little off center. Doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with him. It's just that it's rough. So that's just an area to help me indicate for the loose placement. So I have now something near the corner, something near the center, and then I also have my prior or my existing proportion line, which would be the center of the eye, top to bottom. So it's just a way to help triangulate where that eye should end up, or where this was the center. So this gives me the corner. The mouth related would give me the center of the eye, left to right. And then from there, just going to loosely rough in a sphere. The point of this will be to kind of cover it or submerge it with the tarsus plates and the fat, and that'll be next. If you can, one thing I like to do for this is try to find little opportunities to maybe even overlap that globe or that sphere of the eye. So maybe I tuck it a little bit behind the socket, or maybe that top part kind of tucks behind, just to build a more form-based relationship of overlaps to the structure of this eye. So now what are we dealing with when we start to connect the eye and build some context for its position? Well, we discussed this very briefly in our roadmap, the canthal ligament and tilt. So your eye is held in place by a ligament, and that would be, you could see this sometimes like a little boxy area. So I've drawn that over here in part of that roadmap lesson, where I'm thinking about the way the eye is held in place. And then it's worth noting too that I would say, as far as anatomy and structure and thinking about the way figures are held together, the most influential teachers for me by far have been Scott Eaton and Andrew Carse, in terms of thinking through and understanding a lot of these ideas. And then the drawing side would be a little different. I would say someone like John Watkiss or Glenn Vilppu helped me understand shape and the design of muscles and their application to form. So a lot of this it's not mine. It's something that could be traced back to, of course, different influences. So here's my canthal ligament, and then that's going to go across and attach to the inside of the temple here. So that's what holds the eye in place. The result, or what would be resulting from those, would be the tarsus plates themselves, and that's the eyelid. So this would be kind of the boxier surface of the eye. If we think about, that eye, look at an eye from a side view, and we kind of do an enlarged version here. So this would be the ball of the eye. We can know, or we could see and notice that the eyelids themselves are planar, kind of sharp, small forms, of course. But one benefit to seeing this might be that corners always are ready areas for highlights, or areas that you would see highlights. So when you're trying to interpret that highlight around the lid or the intersection to the eye, highlights are always points of texture or points of corners. One more consideration of design. Remember we talked about the canthal tilt a little bit in our roadmap too. So if you want to customize an eye or match an eye specifically, more important than, what do we mostly focus on? Again, the iris and the pupil and then the highlight at the top. We're not too different here. Like most of us have two ellipses or two balls that are kind of concentric for the eye. We may have differences in hue in the iris, but other than that, it's not too dissimilar. What really changes is the tilt. So two-dimensionally, what is the axis of the eye across? Is it low to high? Right? The eyelid can change in these directions, or high to low, and that we have different ways of assigning beauty based on those. So the stylized, beautiful eye in comics or pinup is always that low to high on the outside. So that would be something worth starting to think about, as maybe you could think of that as the gesture of the eye even. So in designing this, let's start to build up our plate. So I'm going to bring from this box the eye, going to hit. As soon as it touches, I'm just going to revert back to ideas of form intersection. So the tarsus plate comes as a result of this area of the ligament. It spreads, comes across, and then drops back down. As soon as I start to push over this eye, I'm just tracing the form of that sphere and then bringing it back to that initial alignment of that canthal ligament and tilt. So that would be maybe the description of the top of the lid. So when we look at his and we say, well, why don't I see that here? Why is it a soft kind of fold and then a drop back? Well, that would be the surrounding area of fat. So we want to take a look at this first, and then we'll come back and maybe make a study of some of those shapes. But more in the constructive or just the idealized way of thinking this, what I always try to do is look for this plane change. So this one right here, that width and depth, same thing. So you could just trace that maybe. And I'm going to exaggerate it in this one based off what's available in the reference, so that you're able to kind of think and process more the plane changes I'm looking at. And so then we could have muscle attaching to this. But the overall idea is that, now think about your larger surfacing lines again, like what I did a lot in the prior videos, where you're using lines to think about these new perspective relationships between one part and another. And that's important for our eye, right? Because we need as much protection as possible. So now this becomes a little plane or surface that keeps the material out. We'd have the lash on top of that, and that'll keep dust out, sweat out. And so now we've built that. And further consider how much you could learn from these planes in terms of the light and shadow effects. Like, don't we always see, especially in the top lid or daylight, that there's some kind of cast shadow that always groups on the top of the eye, from or with the pupil from that lid. So that's a good way to think about how light would be impacting the design of line and perspective. Everybody has asymmetrical eyelids. So this would be the design. This is the gesture, or another way to think gesture of the eye. It's pretty consistent to anatomy, right? That all muscles or all anatomical parts, limbs especially, would have this relationship of asymmetry, passive and active curves. So we want to stay away, if we're not purposely stylizing from this eye, right? Or I guess an anime eye, if you want to do something that's more kind of traditionally realistic or Western realistic. The exception to this, or what the people always ask me is, well, what about differences in ethnicity? Isn't there a more consistently symmetrical eye in different ethnic groups? And the answer is not especially, or not particularly. What's different is that the fat above the eye, so we have fat that lives above our eye. A good example of this is the Anatomy for Sculptors book does a good job describing this. And it's called a monolid when we lose this spacing. So there's a tendon that will hold fat above the eye in some Western ethnicities. Right? So you get this really sharp description or differentiation between fat and then the lid. This is absent in monolid eyes. So this fat will start to fall. With the absence of this tendon here that would hold that in place, all of this pulls down and creates this kind of beautiful effect where the tarsus plate itself becomes softer. These are the nuts and bolts for me of likeness, right? Likeness would be your conductor, right? And every section of the drawing has to come up to its specific volume to match the whole, right? And create the whole concert that would be all of these minute forces kind of creating an impact. If you want to understand the likeness, of course, with patient observation, you could just reproduce it. But I'm a little hyper obsessive, so I want to know why I would have the likeness I do. So those are two things to keep in mind, right? But the most important one now would be, I just want to focus when designing the lower lid that I come away with that asymmetry. So the same approach, I'm going to start at my tab or my connection into this. Remember we talked about the importance of spiraling the socket so you get that interior plane. And then when it hits the eye, think about the surface that you're describing. So that's kind of just visualizing the topography of that sphere. And then the peak. The peak of this curve is always going to be slightly offset. The peak or the high point of the upper lid is always higher, closer to the nose. The peak and curve of the lower lid is always higher, further from the nose or closer to the ear. So let's say that's coming up and then starts to pull back and up. And then we could do the same thing here. So that's just a line, but lower lid, just like lips, we're going to talk about lips the same way, have a depth and a height. So if I just leave it like this, I really get no understanding of the basic perspective here. So it can be light, but I'm going to swing just another parallel line in here. And so what this does now is gives me a top plane for the lower lid. That's going to end there. And I think if you look at the reference, you could see in that same area that there's some highlights. There's a difference in light and in shadow taking place in that area. And then I'll think about that kind of boxy area ending. So this would be for me step one. I'm kind of thinking about the eye as a form and then developing on top of the eye its secondary perspectives. So I'm separating each one. Now, if you're a little more comfortable with these ideas, or let's say you have a pretty good, or you're comfortable in terms of the development of perspectives, maybe you just go right to this step. Maybe you don't need to stack it in terms of, first having your sphere, placing it, then interpreting the ligament and the eyes on top. That's always the process I'm going to give you is always the most spelled out and slow so that you have complete transparency as to what I'm thinking. But you might be able to combine them, right, and create your own style or way of building out faces as a result much more expediently. Let's take a look at some of the fat that we might see or end up seeing around the eye. The least interesting part to me is just put 2 circles here, right? So that we could put in the iris, and then we could put in the pupil. I just always kind of forget because it doesn't add as much as some of the other things that we've discussed. I know it's important. And what I would be thinking about here is that the iris and the pupil create different surfaces to the eye. So they do create like this beveled rays. And that would be why we always get highlights here, right? Because that addition of that small form does create a mini plane. But, going back to now, we shifted gears into light and shadow. I could see how, that upper plane of the eye with the light really does block and create shadow in here. And that shadow starts to create a grouping with the pupil. So that'd still be transitioning to a step ahead, but that's where all this goes. I always wanted to understand the complete structure of the figure so that I could be better at painting. It's never really about just drawing to draw. It was always about something else. So let's talk about some fat, and I won't get too crazy, but I mostly think about 5 different shapes of fat that will kind of surround and create a buffer, right? A soft area around the eye. Now think about the eye. It's just, again, internal organ exposed on the outside of the face. It's housed in all of this rigid skull and architecture. And part of what the eye is doing is moving around, right? So there's muscles that are inside the skull, as we mentioned, inside the socket, as I mentioned yesterday, that are attaching at the back or side of the eye and moving it to look up, to look down, right? So we need soft tissue around this so that it's not harmed. Let's go clockwise here, and I'm going to start from this inside corner. This area here is called nasal fat. And nasal fat would kind of just live in this, get pinched down by that canthal ligament, and then start to create this kind of inside buffer against the nose and cheek. So that's here. All of this fat is held in place when you're young by what's called an orbital septum, or kind of think of it like a vacuum seal. Now, the reason this is important is because when you age, that seal becomes weaker, and so you start to get what I have, right, which would be lines or shapes or impressions or the fat herniating against the skin. The reason I'm jumping to this now is so that you understand a key principle of aging. Right, so I can see some of that starting to take place on our model's face here. Maybe that's just swelling as a result of, fatigue, but because it doesn't look old enough that it's yet impacting the face, but it may be. And so this would be that key area where when that seal weakens and the face ages, gravity is going to start to pull down. Those shapes create more of an impression, and then you've aged your character or your sitter. We can leave some of the complicated names out, but I'll look at another pocket here. So just kind of moving around. I'm going to share a rarer one that I just think is kind of fun or interesting. If you're a little bit older like me, you may be aware of a strange and eccentric character actor named Steve Buscemi. Steve Buscemi has really unique looking eyes. And one of the reasons he has unique eyes is he has some rare pre-tarsus fat that just builds and lives right on the tarsus plate of the eye, the eyelid. But that's a way that you could also, think about what makes somebody look like somebody. It's not always just rendering the pupil. It's about the larger context, the way faces are put together. So just kind of this weird exploration of fat always intrigued me from that standpoint. It answered the questions I really never understood. Likeness, or it contributed to them. Aging, unique looks. We'll go out to this lateral edge here. So lateral meaning just outside, medial inside. Put that little pocket there. So you just think of this like a floaty in the pool, or something you'd swim in the pool, a ring up above. So once we get into the upper portion, this is a gland, but also can have a significant impact on the eye. So here, and I will use this also to make an observation about the form of the socket. This is a common one that can fold down. So we talked about that here, right? The way it can impact the eye, and I think it's done exactly that here. So notice that you don't get that very rigid look of the tarsus plate in this individual. It's really low down. So maybe that helps me to think about the softening or the lack of that kind of structure for this specific face. In aging, not to overshare, but 2 family members, my dad and my uncle, who both because of age had to have, little outpatient surgeries to help with their vision, because some of that fat can kind of weight the top of the lid and impair your vision. But that's basically it, right? These are just the small kind of gestural observations about some of the structural of fat around the eye that I think can impact the way that you think about a specific eye. The contribution of this and the way that it creates the socket is also pretty interesting to me. So from this point, one thing I could start to think about, or I like to think about, is that our eye socket, the way that it's drawn here, we might be tempted to think that that's just a flat plane, right? The eye is just evenly across or designed spatially across the socket. And that's not the case. The case instead, in terms of form, that there would be more asymmetry here, a kind of perspective asymmetry. So sometimes what I'll do in my lids is take and make an S-curve. You can build this off the socket or the keystone, but your socket is not one flat plane. The inside goes in, so this is receding. That's why this part of your socket, as it gets nearer to the keystone and nose, is always darker. So if I make an S-curve here, this is how I'm trying to think about this simply. When I'm trying to look at folds or perspective twists, I quite often will use an S-curve and then try to design some type of ribbon, right? So I'm thinking of this as a twisting ribbon. This part is twisting away. So that's going back, and then this part would be twisting out. This is what your eye socket does above the eye. This part is receding, so this always gets greater degree of shadow. Let's just hatch that in here. And then the twisting across would be a greater prominence of bone as we get closer to the temple, and then more fat, right, closer to the surface. I always find that this aids quite a bit in kind of a sense of realism, or reconciling the face as more or less realistic, right? To not develop some of these forms always makes the face look flatter, even with like a nicely rendered eye. It just never feels like there's depth. Some other areas that might contribute to this is that we mentioned this briefly in the roadmap, but there's additional pockets of fat that live around this area. This is a very common area for women stereotypically, but you can also have it on men. This is called roof fat. So you could think of the roof of the socket, like the roof of the house. That's an acronym that I won't bore you with, but this would be a pocket that might contribute to this look. So we talked about the upward lift of the eye and that more aesthetically pleasing design. It gives that greater softness, but it's also a nice way to maybe think about this pushing out, right? That there's just more mass here on the outside of that socket than there is on the inside. So there's our eye setup, roof fat here, and then because it's interesting, let's think about what we've added. So I had my front plane for the forehead. So maybe when you're adding these, think about you're just softening the little soft tissue curves. It's not something I would do if I'm like really trying to take the drawing to a finish, but because this is emphasizing more the form and its development, I'm interested in every step and noting how I'm chipping away one surface, one plant at a time at that larger, more organic look or structure. The eyebrow, of course, we could put in there. So one thing I like to do with the eyebrow is, I think the goal, or the long-term goal for me, is that you understand everything so well that you're able to use organic form or organic details to suggest all of the depth and complexity of the inside. So what do I mean by that? Well, I think the job of learning to draw might be that first you look to discover all of the planes. You have to first find them all. So in this video and this lesson, it's about finding everything, understanding everything. After you find it all, then you hide it all. So you want to artfully hide it in a way that can suggest it, but still save you the labor. So what I like to do with the eyebrow, and this would be an example of that, is the eyebrow is a great organic detail, but if you hook it, right, now you've told the audience about a plane change. So this would be a way of saying all that stuff. That's where the turn of the temporal fossa is, this is the brow, this is perspective in one line. So that would be, for me, the way that a direct line drawing would be built, right, is by finding everything and then looking for artful ways to hide it. So maybe this brow would be, we would use that to do the same, right? Start to change the direction in an area that signals planes for me, or would signal a plane. So it basically goes over, and then choosing that area for it to go down. Okay, so let's start to work our way down the face. Here's another area of my favorite fat. This would be soof, which means under. So you have your roof for eye fat, and you have your soof. So the acronym would be sub. So like submarine, that would be under the water. This is under the eye. This is another important one for aging, specifically for what it's covering, right? Like what is it that a piece of fat in this area would be hiding? Well, when we go back to you think about our bones, what is in that area? Oh, that's the cheekbone. So if on this one I just come back and put my cheek glasses, that soof fat covers precisely that moment in your cheek where we did the glasses. The transition from that frame to the lens is a key marker of age. So as we start to age, we see more and more this little cashew. Well, it looks like a cashew to me, but maybe it could be a triangle or something like that. But when this ages, you get this really prominent area of bone, and then this fat falls. So the gesture of age really is gravity, of course, right? That's obvious. And so what it leaves is it starts to pull down. You kind of get this darker triangle of form that's gotten lower, and then that fat will just sink or drop. Okay, so that's the eye. Maybe we could take a look at it in a different angle, just to give you without all of the explanation of what's there, just to see how we get more of a quicker lay-in. So same thing, let's go through some of our steps if you wanted to follow along and create an eye. I'm going to start by looking at the wing of the nose and relate it up. That might give me the corner of the eye. I can make a preliminary assessment about where the corner of the mouth is. Use these to get my guidelines. Mostly the guidelines, again, are about not slamming the eyes to be right on top of each other. I've done and gone through so many different guardrails, the spacing of the nose with the keystone to get the eyes to be placed, and then another stage where here I'm just trying to create relational lines to move that eye back. Unfortunately, it doesn't work as well on the other side, so here I just kind of, I guess pun intended, just eyeball it, or I just kind of sight it, what is the shape that I get there, and then do my best to overlap, but just thinking about the form alone. And then you could see, right, hopefully you have a greater awareness for why this looks rounded, or why we might see a little choppy plane and then a rounder form, or why we might see a little boxier attachment right there. Let's do our tilt or canthal ligament. Decide, I'll just do it even, but you could decide how you want that to look, or you could make a study of different people and see if you could find different variations. Then bring it across. As soon as it hits the eye, we'll bring it over, and then that's the peak. When I find that peak to the lid, then I'll start to create a wrapping line that describes the form, and then pull it back to that attachment on the other side. Let's try to force, even though I know it's softer in him, let's try to force a drop for that underplane, just so we're making sure to see these lids or plates as something that has a perspective. Again, my goal in this is out, back, on, and then same thing for the lower lid. But you don't have to do the entire subdivision of all the pockets of fat here, but maybe you could do something simpler. Maybe you could just say, well, yeah, I remember there was that ribbon idea. So I'm just going to add like a softer tissue ribbon, so that would be going to the outside of the eyelid. But I could see in this now that, all this area starts to get shaded. So that's interesting. So maybe I'll just take that S curve here and bring that out. And so as all of this starts to go in, now I have an understanding or appreciation for, why I might use shadow there. And that's always the goal. Shadow's fun. You just want to have as little frustration doing it as possible when it's time for it. And maybe we could bring some of that up here. Maybe that starts to turn away a bit. So that would be just a different way you could build a relationship to the soft tissue forms of fat around the eye. And then on this side, comes out, hits the ball of the eye, swings around, then back up and connects. What have I added? Maybe the thickness of my line instead could just represent that plane instead of having to build out a little corner. And then this might come out and then back. And then here's that description for the lid there. And then that will swing back and up. And I could get that there is that highlight. So I'm looking for highlights as areas where I'd grab that corner and turn it. So that would be a corner or plane change there. And then instead of doing all the individual pockets, maybe you just make like a ring. It's like, oh, I'm just going to put a light line here because maybe that'll come in handy later. Right, so I could think of this for now as where that soft tissue form around the eye would be. And then, the other side doesn't offer it as much. Right? But if I had anything there, maybe it would just be about trying to do some wraps, right? Or just hooking some wrapping lines to get the basic idea of where that would be. So here'd be an example of the way that eye fat can look when you really have it clear. So in this one, let's do a quick setup here so you can get a sense or appreciate the structure of a different quality of age. I realize some of the things I'm saying may be bizarre or look like a lot of work to develop an eye, especially for someone that's young where it may not be clear or super present. So here's where it may benefit us a little more. I think it would benefit you all the time because even in someone that's young, you may need to know it more. Have you ever had the experience of drawing someone that's younger, especially a female, and having that drawing look, despite how hard you tried to get it right, look very old? So it seems like any misplaced line on a younger model or younger sitter ages them. So having a precision, kind of knowing where you're trying to put your lines may help in youthful models, just by editing your choices or making your choices more economical. So I think in him, I can really see that ribbon idea really well and the fat. But let's start with another example, just to get this aged eye. Here's that tab. Usually that's pretty light, or it can be a lighter value. Comes up, grabs onto the eye. You could do this as a curve, or you could try to see it as planes. Maybe I go up, across, down. Gotta make it a little bit choppier. It's really up to you. Sometimes I think you get the best curves from straights. So if you ever feel like your curves don't give you the form you want, just take a step back and try to carve them out with straights. And then on this side, comes out, peak in the curve here. So we still got that asymmetry, and then back up. I see a little of the plate down here. So that boxier area for the eyelids clearer. That's my top plane. Yes, of course. Here's the boring part, 2 ellipses. And then we always have the little punctum here. So that would be, surfacing lines would make it more interesting to me. That would come out and back and down. Here's the lid across. So out, down. And then what I think is interesting on this one is his gaze is directed in this way. So it looks like his eye is kind of pulled in. And then it almost looks like this area has gotten squashed, right? Or it's herniating because the eye is rolled in a way that's pushed against the fat on that side. So that would be a weird way to think about maybe the squash and stretch of the fat around the eye as it moves. Kind of intense, but interesting. And so here would be the shapes, which I think are pretty clear on him. So we do our 3 across. And then look how if we take that S-curve from this and pull it over, how we start to see that same quality of ribbon or twisting in and out, socket pushing back in this area and out on the other side. This would be the nasal fat that starts to pull down and under here, peeks back out, kind of pinched down by that ligament. I can see this area really nicely. So you can do some surfacing lines on that. And then the lateral here. So as far as the roof fat goes, maybe on him it slid down. Maybe that's what we could account or describe that feeling of compression on this side from. Right, this is that thinking or processing of age. So maybe we could see, just imagine, right? I can't see it, of course, but maybe some of these lines could be pinch lines. I understand they're likely crow's feet. That would be wrinkle. For the most part, I like to try to design aging on a face minus wrinkles. Wrinkles is just the fatiguing of skin, right? So a wrinkle would be like, if I look at his forehead, for example, here's the frontalis muscle of the forehead. Wrinkles always take place perpendicular to the path of a muscle's pull. So here, the path of this muscle's pull is this. It raises your brow, it lifts. So the wrinkles are this way. That's it. So the eye, right, is a spiral muscle. It's a sphincter muscle, unfortunately. That might scar some of you. So here is the shape. So the pull, the path of pull, the skin will be pulled this way. So that's perpendicular. Same thing as your mouth. If you ever met or known a family member that's smoked their whole life, you get lines around the mouth that are the same. They kind of from the constant grabbing with the muscle of the mouth. So that's what I would mostly think or refer to these crow's feet, but I would use them sparingly. I don't think that's something that you want to rely on for aging a face, is just the idea of the wrinkles. Right? This is just more interesting to me. And then look at what's happened here. So our SUF fat has left, the under fat. So what do I see in him? I see this weird shape here. So now I reliably know that that is the composition of the face in terms of aging. Because that little pocket of fat has moved, this becomes exposed. So maybe we could even, let's bring this out as a plane down. And then see how it's created this little cavity or gap underneath? That's the fat dropping. Well, the other thing or area of fat that would cover this is your malar fat, and that's your cheek fat. I referenced this briefly the other day with babies, how giant their cheeks are, because all that fat is held really high. So that would be covering a lot of this as well. Malar fat is this in age. So if we wanted to de-age him, I would just take this and pull it back up into here and then start to erase some of those plane changes. Right, that would be the easy way to start that process. When we age, that malar fat starts to fall and collapse against the side of the nose. It'll never go farther than the corner of the mouth. So if you take the corner of the mouth and relate it to your cheekbone, this is the basic placement of your smile muscle. It never goes past that, and it always is one of two designs. It's either convergent or parallel. So that would be the malar. It just slides down with age. So that would be another reason that we're seeing this bone so clearly, but that area of SUF fat would also be another point that softens or protects that little corner. Right, and then we'd be ready to start dropping some shadows on this. Or I would feel confident at this point that I have all my forms spelled out and discussed. So here's the eye in the kind of the same diagrammatic model that you could see that would be equivalent to how we looked at it in our front view over here. So in that sense, you have the lecture of all the pieces, an example of how it would be drawn with a bit more brevity in a younger person here, and then how you would interpret that same eye and the eye's look in somebody that really has, or much more evident, aging in that area.